just after 6:20. Let's take a look at your money. Since President Donald Trump's tariffs on many foreign goods took effect in early February, there's been a lot of discussion on the impact tariffs might have on consumer prices.
One of the initial concerns was that the tariffs would once again send inflation soaring higher. But is that the case, and what does the actual economic data say?
Financial advisor.
Yeah, he's right here.
Jesse here to answer everything just like that. Good morning, Mark.
I'm getting introduced in stereo from both of you.
For the people in the back who can't hear, right?
Exactly.
We say it louder. So how exactly do we define inflation and just to the point that it actually gets to consumers and problems for the economy?
Inflation is officially defined as the annual percentage increase in consumer prices. So with an inflation rate at 3%, it means that consumer prices, on average are now 3% higher than they were 12 months ago. But in and of itself, inflation, isn't an inherently bad thing. Inflation, i.e. rising prices, simply means that, consumers are spending their money. They're going out and buying all those goods and services, which ultimately, charges our economy forward. All that spending, all that consumer demand, that simply creates an upward pressure on consumer prices. But the key word with inflation, though, is moderation. Now, the Federal Reserve deems 2% to be that ideal target rate of inflation that strikes that balance between rising prices and economic growth. But if you remember, just a couple of years ago, inflation jumped from 1.7% all the way up to a 42-year high of 9%.
Yeah, we do remember that.
Yeah,
Yes.
hard to forget that one, a 42-year high in inflation.
Right.
Exactly.
Yes.
And Mark, we've had these tariffs imposed on many foreign goods for the past 10 months or so. So where's inflation currently at right now?
There's a number of different benchmarks that are used to actually measure inflation. Two of the more heavily used are the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and what's called PCE, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. Now, most of the time, these two indexes are pretty close together. But if we look at the CPI, in January, again, before all these tariffs and trade wars started, the CPI reported inflation at 3%. Look at it today. Also 3%. We look at now what's called core CPI, which strips out the more seasonal and volatile food and energy prices. In January, core CPI reported inflation 3.3%, actually a little bit lower today at 3%. PCE, January 2.6%. Went up a little bit to 2.8%, but now finally we look at core PCE again, stripping out those volatile and seasonal food and energy prices. Inflation has remained the same at 2.8% as it was in January. So again, we look at all of these different measures of inflation, and inflation today is, at about the same level as it was back in January before all these tariffs and trade wars started.
And perhaps more importantly, is there any indication as to what inflation will do over the next year?
Yeah, great question. At its December meeting just this past Wednesday, the Federal Reserve kind of gave us some good news on inflation. It lowered its inflation forecast for 2026. It now expects inflation to decline from its current level of, kind of around 3% down to a level of about 2.5%. For 2027, even a little bit better news. The Fed now sees inflation falling kind of closer to that 2% target rate of inflation that we ultimately do want to get back to. So
It's certainly been in the headlines for quite a while now.
But it definitely going in the right direction, though.
Yes.
For sure.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mark.
Absolutely. See you next Monday.